Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 12 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league, over the span of time between weeks 7 through 11. Again, a lot of the performances that occurred from weeks 1 through 6 are not relevant any longer. Even though there have been big performances against defenses, a lot of these defenses have changed, whether it's with injuries and or improving or players just not playing as well as they used to over the course of the season. So if we go ahead and isolate the spectrum of time between week 7 through 11, we can give ourselves a little bit more information in regards to which of these wide receivers we absolutely must play based on matchups and which wide receivers we might want to avoid going into this week. After we talk about matchups, we'll then transition into our top 36 wide receiver conversation, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and statistics in regards to how I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of week 12. Again, we have our first 18 on screen currently, as we'll then transition to rankings 19 through 36, giving you guys my individual opinion on each of these players. Now, for those of you who are looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. Also, while you're down there, if you have not yet already and you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, not only to help you win your week 12 matchups, but of course win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Now, speaking of winning week 12 matchups, we will be live streaming here on the channel on Thursday morning from 7 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, the first game on Thursday morning starts at 9:30 a.m. So for the 2.5 hours before then, I'll be preparing you guys and hopefully setting your lineups, getting everything ready to go. We'll have rankings on screen, all of that available to you guys, answering questions throughout that 2.5 hour span. Again, stuff like that is what we're bringing on a daily basis. So if you have not yet already subscribed, of course, click that bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest live streams, all that kind of jazz. Also, while you're down in the description of the video, do not forget to check out PrizePicks. Speaking of the Thursday night game, there is an entry that PrizePicks is offering for this Thursday night's game, as Justin Jefferson currently at a number of 0.5 receiving yards. So that is an automatic more. You can add that to your entry as a free square and go ahead and put together a couple entries. Even if you don't have anybody playing in the Thursday night games, you can go ahead and look forward to something. And of course, have Justin Jefferson be the automatic, pair him up with a couple other players and make an entry. Check out the link down in the description, travel to PrizePicks and sign up today and make a first time deposit when you're using promo code Andrew, because when you use the code, you'll get your first time deposit immediately doubled up to $100. So if you deposit 20, you'll be given 20. You deposit 50, you'll be given 50. Check that out today. And obviously pick Justin Jefferson going more than 0.5 receiving yards for this Thursday's game. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about the wide receiver position going into week 12, beginning with matchups. Again, as you can see to the right side of the screen, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format over the course of the last 5 weeks, weeks 7 through 11. Now, when we isolate those statistics, obviously we see that the Minnesota Vikings, San Francisco 49ers, and Buffalo Bills are the worst teams against the opposing wide receiver position, which in my opinion was a shock. I didn't expect to see this, especially considering to what high regard we keep the San Francisco 49ers and Buffalo Bills defenses at. Yet, their secondaries have not been healthy, and they have been getting brutalized by the matchups that they have taken on. I mean, just look at last night. DeAndre Hopkins, Greg Dortch, even AJ Green had themselves great statistics overall as a trio against that San Francisco 49ers defense. Of course, the Buffalo Bills just got torched by Donovan Peoples-Jones and Amari Cooper as of late, so why not Amon-Ra St. this week? We'll talk about all that, but in terms of giving you some context as to some of the matchups, of course, those are the better matchups going into the week. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the toughest matchups, the New England Patriots with their top 2 cornerbacks, Jonathan Jones and Jack Jones. Both these guys just completely dominating, one of them being a rookie cornerback. The fact that Bill Belichick has been able to replace cornerbacks at high levels with younger, less experienced cornerbacks that somehow end up being studs. Like, he replaced Stephon Gilmore with J.C. Jackson. Then he replaced J.C. Jackson with Jack Jones. And it's just a complete cycle of Bill Belichick just finding stud, cornerbacks and making them absolute nightmares for us fantasy managers on a weekly basis. Now, of course, we know that the New York Jets, they've been playing well. Sauce Gardner, the Houston Texans secondary, obviously playing well. They also have a cornerback who's a rookie. Obviously didn't play this last week, but dude, these rookie corners, they're obviously locking people down. Either way, we'll go ahead and refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video. But let's get into our top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 12, beginning with our number 1. We have Davante Adams. Davante Adams is an absolute stud. We all know this. He's an automatic start. But let me just give you some more confidence on the matter. Besides the fact that he's coming off of a nearly 30-point fantasy productive week last week against the Denver Broncos secondary. I mean, that is no joke. When you're playing up against Patrick Surtain, it is a tough matchup. But not only has he been able to put up 7 or more receptions, 120 or more receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown in each of the last 3 consecutive games, he's been able to do that against Denver, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville. Again, those last 2 games, Denver and Indianapolis, going up against Stephon Gilmore, Rodgers from Indianapolis, Patrick Surtain this last week, it's no joke of a matchup. Yet, Davante Adams continues to find success and continues to be the primary number 1 of this offense, and the reason why many of our fantasy teams continue to win on a weekly basis. Moving on to our number 2. Speaking of a top-tier wide receiver, currently Stefon Diggs is actually the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy half or full PPR scoring format. Coming off of another week in which he had a touchdown, could have very easily had a second touchdown if he had not dropped it down in the end zone. That all being said, he's taking on the Detroit Lions, which in fact is the 6th easiest matchup at the wide receiver position, and they don't have Jeff Okudah available this week. Again, they're playing on Thursday night, and he has already been deemed out. That secondary already is bad, not to mention the fact that Stefon Diggs will be able to take advantage of them in a short week as one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. Moving on, let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Obviously, we know that Tyreek Hill is on an incredible pace, potentially to break Calvin Johnson's most receiving yards in a season record. We'll see. Obviously, the 17th game is going to be the biggest difference maker, but let's talk about how Tyreek Hill has played with Tua Tagovailoa under center. When Tua has been healthy, Tyreek Hill has averaged 10 targets per game, 7 receptions per game, 109 receiving yards per game, and 0.6 receiving touchdowns per game, 18.24 fantasy points per week with Tua under center. Incredible numbers. The fact that we're in a situation where Tyreek Hill is nearly averaging 11 fantasy points per game just off of receiving yardage alone is unbelievable. Not to mention the fact that he scored 4 receiving touchdowns in the 7 games with Tua and is obviously getting a boatload of receptions every single week. He's in a perfect position to succeed. I understand that this week he takes on the Houston Texans, and they've been typically good against opposing wide receivers, but I believe that Tyreek Hill is an exception to that rule. We're obviously starting him once again. Moving on, let's talk about Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson and this entire Minnesota Vikings offense coming off of a bad week. I honestly believe that this is going to be another rough week for the Minnesota Vikings, and hopefully I'm wrong, and we're going to get into a situation where both these teams are playing well and both scoring a lot of fantasy points for our teams. But the biggest issue that I have with Justin Jefferson is obviously he's dealing with a turf toe, and he has to go up against Jonathan Jones and Jack Jones, really good cornerbacks across the board. And let's not forget, they also have to deal with the fact that they're playing on a primetime game against a defense that is going to be getting after Kirk Cousins. The number 1 way to beat Kirk Cousins and to make this entire Minnesota Vikings offense crumble is to send pressure in his direction. With Christian Darrisaw out, Matthew Judon may end up having 4 sacks in this game. We don't even know. You know, he may end up looking like Micah Parsons by the end of the night. If we're going to get into a situation where primetime Kirk Cousins comes out and then the pressure is all over him and he's not able to get the ball out of his hands and in the direction of Justin Jefferson, who will be double covered for a majority of this game, it could be a rough one. I'm just putting it out there, but either way, we must start Justin Jefferson. Moving on. Talking about our number 5, CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb didn't have an explosive week against the Minnesota Vikings, unfortunately, but it mainly had to do with the fact that the score was 40-3 at one point. I mean, they just completely blew off the doors of the Minnesota Vikings defense, and then they just ran out the clock in the second half. And that was expected, right? If you go ahead and mount such an early lead, of course you're going to run to kill the clock and get out of there as quickly as you can, as the Minnesota Vikings pulled their starters relatively early in that fourth quarter, and it was done. Either way, CeeDee Lamb takes on the New York Giants on Thursday night. Adoree Jackson, the number 1 cornerback who's played extremely well for the New York Giants, is not available. He is already deemed out. There is going to be a lot of opportunity for CeeDee Lamb in a matchup in which hopefully it's not going to be a one-sided affair where CeeDee Lamb is not involved just like last week, but we get him involved early and often, find the end zone, and have another massive week. Moving on to DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins, since coming off of the suspension list, has been unbelievable. He's finished on a weekly basis as the number 10, 2, 20, 15, and 15 overall wide receiver. And the last 2 weeks as the number 15 overall wide receiver and a half PPR consecutively, both have been with Colt McCoy. The fact that he's, pretty much quarterback proof, matchup proof, it doesn't matter what DeAndre Hopkins faces, he's a fantastic play. Marquise Hollywood-Brown sounds like he's most likely not going to be returning this week, and Rondale Moore went down with a hamstring injury early in that game, which may hold him out for another week. And on top of it, Greg Dortch, the other wide receiver that filled in for Rondale Moore, is having an MRI on his thumb today. This all being taken into account, DeAndre Hopkins may be the only healthy wide receiver out there for the Arizona Cardinals, coming off of a week in which he was questionable to even play. I mean, again, we know he's a tough son of a gun. He's going to play regardless, but Either way, he's in our lineups. He's a fantastic wide receiver option this week. Moving on to our number 7, we have T. Higgins. Now, speaking of injuries, T. Higgins doesn't have to do with any injuries, but Jamar Chase does. There is a potential in which Jamar Chase practices and plays this week. Do I expect it to happen? Probably not. I believe the organization is going to be very cautious with the way that they approach Jamar Chase's overall injury. Of course, the hip injury that has sidelined him for a couple weeks now. With that all being said, if he's going to be sidelined, which I expect, T. Higgins is a fantastic option. Again, he's coming off of a week in which he had 19.3 fantasy points, 13 targets that led to 9 receptions, and 148 total receiving yards. They take on the Tennessee Titans. The number one way to beat the Tennessee Titans is to throw the ball for probably 60 times in that game. I mean, we just saw it a couple weeks ago with Patrick Mahomes. Because if you're not able to run the ball, which I'm sure the Cincinnati Bengals will struggle in doing so, like we talked about earlier today with Joe Mixon, the Tennessee Titans are only giving up 2.81 yards per carry on average since week 7. That, in my opinion, leads to T. Higgins obviously having to dominate this game in order for this team to beat the Tennessee Titans. And of course, Joe Burrow has to get the ball out of his hands quickly, considering the fact that this pass rush is going to get after him. The last time these two teams faced in the NFL playoffs, Joe Burrow was sacked 9 times. Let's hope that doesn't repeat itself, and T. Higgins has himself a massive week here. Moving on to number 8, Jaylen Waddle. There's only one thing that I wanted to mention in regards to Jaylen Waddle after I talk about his season averages. This year with Tua, under center, healthy, in games in which Tua did not leave early with an injury, Jaylen Waddle is averaging 8 targets, 6 catches, 98 receiving yards, and 0.9 touchdowns per game, 18.06 fantasy points per game. Incredible statistics. That all being said, the fact of the matter is, Jaylen Waddle is only 1.3 fantasy points less than Tyreek Hill in games where Tua is under center and is going to be the starting quarterback for the entirety of that game. Only 1.3 less fantasy points. Just putting that in perspective. Yes, we know that Tyreek Hill is fantastic, but Jaylen Waddle is just on his coattails, barely keeping up with him, but almost about to eclipse him with one big week here. Going up against Houston, doesn't bother me. We're firing him up. Moving on to Terry McLaurin on number 9. Terry McLaurin has the advantage of a matchup and a quarterback that obviously wants to continue to funnel target him. This last week against the Houston Texans, obviously that secondary played very well, and it really did limit Terry McLaurin, considering all they really had to do was run the ball for the entirety of the second half. They mounted a very early 20-point lead, and they just killed clock. That all being said, Terry McLaurin takes on the Atlanta Falcons this week, and that is one of the best matchups at the wide receiver position. Now, the reason why I want to highlight this specific matchup is because last season, Terry McLaurin had the privilege of taking on the Atlanta Falcons, in which he had 6 catches, 123 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 27.3 fantasy points. That is his best career fantasy game ever. So if we're in a conversation where we're taking on the identical defense with the number 1 cornerback that is the same as last season, and of course, we have Terry McLaurin, who has had himself a little bit of a resurgence with Taylor Heinicke taking the quarterback position this season. I mean, right now, Terry McLaurin is number 5 amongst all wide receiver options in terms of air yards. He's only behind Tyreek Hill, Davante Adams, Chris Olave, and Stefon Diggs. Just putting that in perspective. Should be a fantastic play for this week as our number 9. Moving on to our number 10, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. They take on the Buffalo Bills. One of the better matchups of the position. Of course, we've recently seen, Garrett Wilson, 8 catches, 92 yards. Pretty good. Justin Jefferson, 10 catches, 193 and a touchdown. Amari Cooper, 8 catches, 113 and 2 touchdowns. DPJ even in that game, 5 catches, 61 and a touchdown. Incredible performances across the board. But how does this specifically help Amon-Ra St. Brown? Well, luckily, the slot cornerback of the Buffalo Bills has been one of the worst in the league. Teron Johnson is quite literally the 3rd best matchup a slot wide receiver can have going into a given week based on all the targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns that Teron Johnson has allowed already this season. Amon-Ra St. Brown, of course, the number 1 wide receiver of the Detroit Lions, and probably the only guy that is going to be consistently catching the ball from this offense. A fantastic play on Thursday. Moving on, let's talk about A.J. Brown. Even though A.J. Brown is coming off of a relatively underwhelming performance, I understand that it was a very difficult matchup going up against Stephon Gilmore and Rodgers. Those are really good cornerbacks. But this upcoming week, they take on the Green Bay Packers. They've got themselves a pretty good, pair of cornerbacks with Jair Alexander, Rasul Douglas. They've got some good players there. That being said, last week, Thursday night, the Tennessee Titans pretty much showed just exactly what their replacement of A.J. Brown looked like. Treylon Burks came out, had over 100 receiving yards on, 7 receptions, 8 targets, and a fantastic performance. The Green Bay Packers defense were not able to stop A.J. Brown's replacement. But let's see how they'll be able to fare up against A.J. Brown himself, which in my opinion should have himself another big week here. Hopefully we'll get back on track. We'll find the end zone because without Dallas Goedert in this offense, yes, it does make it a little bit more difficult for this team to move the ball. But with the ability to run the ball in comparison to the last couple weeks, it should open up the offense and specifically play action opportunities far more, which will allow A.J. Brown to flourish within the matchup. Moving on to Christian Kirk, the thumbnail for today's video. Christian Kirk this season is averaging 8 targets, 5 catches, 68 receiving yards, and 0.7 touchdowns per game. The biggest difference maker on a Christian Kirk scoreline has been touchdowns this season. The fact that he's been able to score as many as he has is unbelievable. But in the last 4 games that we have seen Christian Kirk play, a lot of those touchdowns have come from the fact that he's getting ample opportunity. 38 targets in the last 4 games. Incredible production. That being said, he has a very difficult matchup this week, taking on the Baltimore Ravens defense, which again are going to be able to stop the run. And when they do, as the number 1 receiving option of the Jacksonville Jaguars, he will be called upon to make a lot of plays, whether it's on the ground, through the air, whether it's out of the backfield, in the slot, out wide, doesn't matter. Christian Kirk can get it done anywhere on this field, and he's already demonstrated that this season. The biggest issue that I have is if, in fact, Marlon Humphreys ends up playing the slot cornerback role this week, that could be devastating for the potential upside of Christian Kirk. While if Williams, their normal nickel back, steps in and tries to cover Christian Kirk in the slot, then we're in a fantastic position where we obviously see him as a top 12 option. Moving on to our number 13, we have Mike Evans. Here's the thing that I have with Mike Evans. I have to play him. He's a stud wide receiver. We know that. But he's literally on a current streak of the most games consecutively in his career where he hasn't scored a receiving touchdown. I'm expecting something to give. Something's got to give, and he's absolutely going to find the end zone this week with Tom Brady. I mean, just look at the first 2 years in which he had Tom Brady under center, 2020 and 2021. He scored 10-plus touchdowns in each of those 2 seasons, but he's nowhere close this year to that number. Hopefully, this offense, retooled, healthy, off the bye, come in and dominate up against Cleveland, who, of course, almost gave up 2 receiving touchdowns to Diggs himself down in the red zone in terms of red zone opportunities, not even deep passing threats that ended up giving him those opportunities. Straight up red zone chances up against the number 1 cornerback. I'm expecting Mike Evans to find the end zone this week. Moving on to DK Metcalf, another one of these premier number 1 outside wide receivers. DK Metcalf, as of thus far this season, has been averaging 8 targets, 5 catches, 58 yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game. As a whole, not the greatest numbers since the beginning of the season. But if you go back to week 3 through 11, he's been a significantly better wide receiver as he's been averaging 12.83 fantasy points per game in comparison to just 10.21. A pretty big difference if you eliminate those first 2 weeks, as he wasn't getting much targets and he wasn't really being given red zone opportunities. And that is the biggest difference maker for a wide receiver like DK Metcalf, because we know he could take the top off of a defense within a singular play. We know he could be a possession guy. We know he can make plays after the catch. But if, in fact, you get him more involvement down in the red zone, it's a fantastic option. They take on the Las Vegas Raiders. The Vegas Raiders are amongst the bottom of the teams in the National Football League in terms of defensive rankings, according to how many yardage they've given up to opposing wide receivers, running backs, everything. They're one of the worst defenses in the National Football League. I absolutely believe that the Seattle Seahawks should be able to take advantage of it this week. Moving on, Amari Cooper is our number 15. The thing that I wanted to show you guys in regards to Amari Cooper, besides the fact that he's coming off of an unbelievably successful week, 8 receptions, 113 yards, and 2 touchdowns, the best performance of his season thus far, the fact of the matter is, his route tree on Sunday was unbelievable. When I was watching this game back, and I was like, dude, why is he always open? What is happening? And then I keep realizing they keep going to the same play. Look at his route tree, according to Next Gen Stats from week 11. He literally ran sideline routes the entire game. On the right side, all he did was run out routes. On the left side, all he did was run fades and maybe 1 or 2 out routes. Over the middle of the field, when in the slot position, obviously successful. But this route tree is not normal. I'm telling you guys, it is not a normal route tree, yet he was still able to carve up that Buffalo Bills secondary. If they continue to utilize him and get him targets, that's the biggest difference maker. There's 2 different Amari Coopers this season. The one that gets opportunity and the one that doesn't. And the one that is getting 10 plus targets per game is obviously a far better receiving option and averaging over 15 fantasy points per game this season. That's all we need. Opportunity that leads to success in fantasy football. Moving on to Tyler Lockett. Our number 16, taking on, of course, the Las Vegas Raiders. We just mentioned them a couple moments ago in regards to DK Metcalf. The Las Vegas Raiders are one of the worst defenses in the National Football League, whether that's stopping the run or whether that's stopping opposing wide receivers. It does not matter. As of the course of the last 3 games, Tyler Lockett has scored a touchdown in every single one of those games. Honestly, should be a 4-game streak, but unfortunately wasn't able to bring in one of those touchdowns. Now, when we're talking about a wide receiver that is in this middle of the wide receiver 2 conversation, the immediate thought in my mind is Tyler Lockett gains this ranking because of his consistency. Thus far this season, he's put up 10 or more fantasy points in 7 out of the last 9 games that he has played. When you are that consistent, you're going to gain the respect from me, and I'm going to put you in this conversation, especially when you take on a great matchup. As of right now, in my opinion, Tyler Lockett, a must play. Moving on to Deebo Samuel at number 17. We talked about it yesterday in terms of the entry that I put forth via PrizePicks, as I was hoping that either James Conner and or Deebo Samuel was going to find the end zone. And both did, but Deebo Samuel found the end zone in a very interesting way with a 39-yard rushing touchdown. If he doesn't end up having that rushing touchdown, he only has a couple rushing attempts for a couple yards, but 7 catches on 9 targets, 57 receiving yards. Ultimately, the highest amount of total targets that he has seen since week 6. That is an incredible number. And in comparison to Aiyuk, who only had 4 targets, 2 catches, it's a pretty big difference. Especially considering the fact that, yes, even though Aiyuk scored 2 touchdowns, the more utilization that Deebo Samuel gets as an outside wide receiver option purely gives me more confidence in those matchups where they're typically tougher. Specifically going up against New Orleans this week, even without Marshawn Lattimore, this has been a pretty good secondary. But considering we are seeing more and more opportunity go in the direction of Deebo Samuel, whether it's on the ground or through the air, it's all bonuses for his overall upside, which we obviously want to play with going into week 12. Moving on, number 18, we have Chris Godwin. Talking about the second Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver. Chris Godwin, last time we saw him prior to the bye, caught his ever-elusive touchdown. Fantastic. We love to see it. That all being said, Chris Godwin is still one of these sketchy wide receivers. He's going to continue to get himself in that range of 8 to 12 overall targets every single week. It's just a matter of what that depth of target looks like and whether or not he's going to get utilization down in the red zone. If we're going to be in a situation where this offensive line can give Tom Brady time, Chris Godwin is always going to find himself open. It's just a matter of Tom Brady having enough time to not just check it down to a running back, but look in the direction of Chris Godwin. Yes, he's typically running shorter routes, but that's all we need. A little bit more time, and they'll be able to dominate. Taking on the Cleveland Browns this week, it's a fantastic matchup. All right, let's move on to the second half of this conversation, beginning with our number 19, Brandon Aiyuk. Again, we've just consecutively talked about 2 Tampa Bay wide receivers, 2 Seattle Seahawks wide receivers, and now 2 San Francisco 49ers wide receivers. Brandon Aiyuk is coming off of an incredible week of 2 receptions, 20 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. A fantastic performance. And even though he broke his streak of 81 or more receiving yards in 5 consecutive games with Jimmy Garoppolo, again, I'll take that performance of 15 fantasy points. I'm happy to do so. They take on the New Orleans Saints, and as long as Brandon Aiyuk continues to catch the eye of Jimmy Garoppolo and maintains his relevant wide receiver 2 standing, I'm all in on playing him once again this week. Moving on to Christian Watson. Christian Watson has to sit at number 20 because he is on a hot streak. And I'm not walking away from the table right now. I'm going to continue to double down on the idea that Christian Watson can get it done again. And if he doesn't, so be it. But I don't want him on my bench. I just don't. He has scored quite literally 5 receiving touchdowns in his last 8 receptions. He takes on the Philadelphia Eagles defense, which again is a tougher matchup. But if Allen Lazard is going to be on the opposite side of the field pulling coverage from Darius Slay, why not Christian Watson on the opposite side, gaining more and more rapport with Aaron Rodgers every single week? That rapport will eventually lead to fantasy points. Moving on, let's talk about Gabriel Davis. Gabriel Davis, over the course of the last 2 weeks, has been good. I mean, even though this last week, 5 catches, 68 yards, only 9.3 fantasy points, doesn't seem like an incredible, productive week. But to be honest, he's just one play away every single week from being a 15-point guy. That's it. We know that Gabriel Davis is capable of taking the top off an opposing defense. And now that he takes on the Detroit Lions, who don't have Jeff Okudah, so that means that their number 2 cornerback has to go cover Stefon Diggs, and their number 3 cornerback has to cover Gabriel Davis. This may honestly be a blowout in which Josh Allen is torching this secondary. I'm expecting Gabriel Davis to have himself one of those big plays, and if he does early on in the game, the rest of this overall production will just be complete upside. Moving on to Chris Olave, our number 22. Even though Chris Olave was relatively quiet in the 3 games prior to taking on the LA Rams, he comes out and goes for a massive 50-yard receiving touchdown in a game in which I did not expect Andy Dalton to have that much production. They completely torched that secondary for the LA Rams. And hopefully going into this week, that momentum that Chris Olave built with 6 targets, 5 catches, 102 yards and a touchdown is going to carry him. Now, he takes on the San Francisco 49ers, which again, they're giving up the second most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average since week 7. And when we look at the most recent productive weeks from wide receivers versus the secondary, Dortch, D-Hop, and Green combined for 23 catches and 244 last night. We saw Carter and Palmer combined for 7 catches, 108 and a touchdown. We saw Kupp and A-Rob 13 catches, 133 and a touchdown. Hardman, Juju, and MVS 14 catches, 267 and 2 touchdowns, while Justin Watson even had himself 1 catch for 4 yards and a touchdown in that game. There have been a lot of productive wide receivers against the secondary as of late. Hopefully Chris Olave is another one. Moving on to Juju Smith-Schuster. Speaking of Juju Smith, the last time we saw him in his last 3 prior games, prior to the concussion game that he sustained against the Jacksonville Jaguars, this man was an unstoppable force. I mean, his 3 fantasy point productive weeks were 13.8, 19.8, and 21.9. if we're going to continue to see him get back on track and, of course, garner the high volume of targets that we were seeing go in his direction earlier this season with no Kadarius Toney, with no McCole Hardman. I understand that there is a potential in which Sky Moore, Justin Watson get a little bit more utilization within this offense, but if Juju Smith-Schuster is back from that concussion, he becomes the primary number 2 receiving threat in this offense, only behind Travis Kelce. Moving on, let's talk about our number 24. We have Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen had himself a pretty good introductory week to make sure that he's still healthy. Yes, he was on a snap count per se, where they only wanted him to play about 30 to 35 overall snaps within that given week. Yet he still played 44 of the 65 overall snaps. Even though they wanted to keep him on a pitch count, they could not contain it. They let him on the field, and he obviously had a good game. Going forward, specifically up against the Arizona Cardinals, if we're going to see another week here in which Byron Murphy, the slot cornerback, is going to be out, by all means, this is an automatic success for Keenan Allen. Moving on to our number 25, we have DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith needs opportunity, purely. It is a fact. Every wide receiver needs opportunity. Every fantasy prospect needs it. But DeVonta Smith this season, in his 3 worst performances, all of them consisted of 4 or less targets. When we're going to be in that conversation of 4 or less targets, you're obviously not going to find much production unless you're getting the ball once for a 50-yard touchdown and you're making your given week. But with Dallas Goedert out, and of course A.J. Brown slowing down as of late, DeVonta Smith has a really great opportunity to catch up and become one of the main priority options within this offense, if not the number 1. 9 targets, 6 catches, 78 yards this last week would have made him the number 1 in this offense. It's just a matter of getting to that upside performance of scoring a touchdown up against the Green Bay Packers. He just needs the opportunity, which hopefully is going to be there once again this week. Moving on to George Pickens at number 26. This rookie wide receiver has been playing out of his mind. Since week 4, he has literally put up 11 or more fantasy points in 5 out of his last 7 games. He has scored a touchdown in 3 out of his last 4 games. And to be totally honest, this last weekend's performance of 16.3 fantasy points should have been even more. He dropped a 49-yard receiving touchdown. He could have had himself an incredible game that defined him as the breakout going forward, but he's already broken out. And yes, he does take on a pretty difficult matchup going up against, some pretty good cornerbacks. Hopefully, Deontay Johnson is going to pull majority of that coverage from Gilmore. And when everyone's distracted by Deontay Johnson, George Pickens can have himself another big week here for fantasy purposes. Moving on to Joshua Palmer. We all saw Mike Williams re-aggravate that ankle injury on Sunday night. Obviously, it opened up more opportunity for Joshua Palmer later in the game. But even prior to that injury, Joshua Palmer was a mainstay in this offense. Caught himself a 50-yard receiving touchdown early in that game and will continue to be a main part of this offense. The fact of the matter is, with the return of a healthy Gerald Everett, hopefully this week, Keenan Allen will once again play DeAndre Carter. This is only going to open up more opportunity for Josh Palmer. The last couple weeks prior to the return of Keenan Allen, he was the number 1 receiving threat, and a lot of defenses keyed in on stopping him. Now that you go ahead and you add more threats to this offense, it opens up more opportunity for him to be the number 1 option of this offense, take on a pretty advantageous matchup in Arizona, and put up another great week here. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr., our number 28. In the last 4 games that he has played with Matt Ryan, his target counts are 16, 9, 7, and 9. When you're getting that volume of opportunity, of course, fantasy success is just around the corner. Now, T. Higgins obviously took advantage of the matchup last week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The question is whether or not Michael Pittman Jr. will be able to do so. Again, T. Higgins went for 13 targets, 9 catches, 148 up against the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary. I'm hoping that Michael Pittman Jr. can see enough opportunity to lead to that level of production. But even if he isn't, and he's not able to potentially score an ever-elusive touchdown, I think a higher-end wide receiver 3 value is pretty good for Michael Pittman Jr. going into the week. Moving on to Courtland Sutton. Very similar production, very similar opportunity levels in my mind. With Jerry Jeudy missing another practice today, the expectation is that we're going to see Courtland Sutton be the lone wide receiver option in this offense that honestly has potential for upside. Yes, we know that Russell Wilson's not playing well, but Courtland Sutton is still going to get himself probably 10 fantasy points and will have the upside of getting to that 16-point range up against Carolina. We just got to keep our fingers crossed and hope he meets that range. Moving on to Jakobi Meyers at number 30. The Minnesota Vikings are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average from weeks 7 through 11 in a half PPR scoring format. Not only is it one of the best matchups at the position, Chandon Sullivan, the slot cornerback of the Minnesota Vikings, is quite literally a top 5 matchup for slot wide receivers. It's going to be a fantastic opportunity for Jakobi Meyers coming off of a game in which, of course, that offense did not score a singular touchdown. They had a tough time moving the ball. Obviously, the weather conditions were definitely a factor, and so was the fact that they were taking on a really tough defense in the New York Jets. Going up against one of the better matchups within the given week, Jakobi Meyers is an automatic play. Moving on to Allen Lazard. Now, there's multiple potentials that we could see from Allen Lazard. The first one being that he gets his touchdowns back. And instead of Christian Watson scoring, the ever-elusive 1 to 2, 3 touchdowns, maybe one of them go in the direction of Allen Lazard. I mean, we got to remember, this guy had 11 targets last week. There were so many, air yards that weren't, acted upon. The opportunity was there, but he just couldn't complete it. There were a couple opportunities there where he could have scored a touchdown, could have made a couple 30-yard plays down the field, yet he wasn't able to haul them in. If we're going to be in a situation where Allen Lazard is going to continue to gain this level of opportunity, it's only a matter of time which he potentially finds the end zone once again and becomes one of those stable 12 to 15 point players like we saw earlier this season. Moving on to Parris Campbell, our number 32. Parris Campbell, even though in 3 out of the last 4 games he has scored a touchdown with Matt Ryan, and my assumption last week was that, yes, it's a fantastic matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, and there's momentum on the side of the Indianapolis Colts. Unfortunately, Parris Campbell wasn't able to bring in more than just 5 catches for 67 yards. And even though 9.2 fantasy points is not a bad week for a wide receiver 3 option, ranking him anything higher than this would be very risky, specifically going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So as of right now, I think he's a pretty safe option with certain upside on hand. Moving on to Treylon Burks, at number 33. We're going to talk about a couple rookie wide receivers here. Beginning with Treylon Burks, if in fact he's going to continue to see deep target opportunities within this offense and or a stable volume of targets. I don't even need it to be 30 yards down the field. As long as he's getting targets, he's a talented enough wide receiver after the catch to make plays. If in fact we approach this matchup with the sense of Derrick Henry dominating early on the ground, and then the play action game begins to open itself up, the Cincinnati Bengals secondary has been beat up all season long. They're not getting healthy anytime soon. Treylon Burks could be a fantastic play here. Moving on to Donovan Peoples-Jones. Again, we know he's an automatic play. The guy has literally finished as a top 36 wide receiver for like 7 consecutive weeks in a half PPR scoring format. So he's going to be in this conversation coming off the best week of his season. Hopefully we'll have another great one against Tampa Bay. Moving on to our number 35, we have Garrett Wilson. Under the assumption that there is an offensive quarterback switch to Mike White and or Joe Flacco, Garrett Wilson jumps in these rankings. I'm hoping that a guy that literally played 100% of the offensive snaps is going to get himself more than 2 receptions for 12 yards. We're going to have to wait and see. But if Zach Wilson is the starting quarterback by the time we get to Sunday, not interested, I'm benching him. But hopefully, fingers crossed, we're in a situation where Garrett Wilson has Joe Flacco or Mike White. You got to remember, earlier this season, Joe Flacco from weeks 1 through 3 targeted Garrett Wilson 33 times in those 3 games. Fingers crossed. Moving on to our final option, it is Drake London. I do not expect the Marcus Mariota-led Atlanta Falcons to be able to consistently run the ball on the Washington Commanders. Therefore, with no Kyle Pitts out there, Drake London has to step up and literally catch everything. Hopefully, he'll get more than a couple targets. I mean, he literally only had 1 reception for a touchdown this last week. My primary hope is that Drake London gets more utilization within this offense because of the necessity to pass the ball more. And once they find themselves in those desperate situations, Marcus Mariota will go to Drake London as his security blanket with no more Kyle Pitts out there on the field. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. These are my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 12 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Of course, check out PrizePicks because we have a very interesting opportunity on hand to go ahead and have a free square within a potential entry for Thursday night's game. Justin Jefferson pick more on his 0.5 receiving yards going into, of course, the matchup. Do not forget, we are live streaming Sunday morning from 7 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I will probably not sleep that night, but either way, we're going to have fun, set our lineups, and get ready to go for Thursday's game. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.